Welcome to the Health Edge, translating the science of self-care. I am Mark Pettis, and I'm with my buddy John Bagnulo. John, it's really great to see you, my friend.
It's great to see you, Mark. It's been too long.
It's been way too long, and so we've just gotten by another autumn equinox and into this beautiful fall season, and I'm sure everyone is noticing how quickly our daylight is shrinking as night gets longer and days get shorter. And it seems a good time of year to revisit a topic that we've talked a lot about through the years, but one that I think is gaining a bit more attention and interest in the scientific community, the medical community, and that's the importance of light and health and our awareness that as our seasons change and as we have this expansion of time under dark nights and artificial lights in our indoor environments, that there are some unique health issues there, and there are many things that people can do to try to minimize the effects of shorter days, longer nights over this long fall-winter season. And so it seemed a good time for that topic. And we had a study. And let me just pull my screen up here. John, hopefully this
that's clear.
Is clear. And this is a very recently published study that came out of China. This is from BMC Medicine, a international journal, excellent peer-reviewed research. And the title of this study is Trajectories of Night Light Exposure and Risk of Overweight and Obesity. This was a 15-year longitudinal cohort study of over 200,000 Chinese children. These kids were between the ages of 5 and 9. They were followed over 15 years. And, there are things you can do in countries like China where everyone is sort of under the same system and subject to testing and the ability to really track large amounts of data over time. And what they were interested in addressing, this again is an observational trial, and as we always talk about, John, you can't draw firm causation from these relationships, but what they looked at were 4 patterns of artificial light exposure in these cohorts of young children. And they essentially fell into 4 categories. There was one cohort that got much less artificial light at night, and remained so during that 15-year follow-up. There were kids on the opposite end of the spectrum that at very young ages of 5, that sort of kindergarten, preschool age, were getting very high amounts. This was based on surveys and exam and historical documentation recording, where they had very high amounts of artificial light at night, which persisted through that 15-year follow-up. And there were 2 other cohorts sort of in between, one that started low and ended high, and another that started on the high side and came down a little bit over time. But, as we'll show from this data, when you're exposed at non-native artificial lighting in a relatively large exposure time at a very young age that persists, what the study ultimately showed is that you have a much greater risk of obesity, being overweight, and of course, as we know and always talk about, many of the metabolic risk factors that accompany that change in body phenotype. And just a few other pieces of data, John, and then I'll pause. I don't want to dominate our conversation here, but just to set the stage, this is some research from Dr. Martin Moore-Eid, who's a former Harvard light researcher, one of my go-to experts. This is a topic I love and think a lot about. And Martin has done some really superb work. And here's an interesting graphic, John, of data from almost 60,000 Apple Watch users, right? So now we're in this era where we have these wearable devices and the ability to capture data in ways that historically has not been possible. And this looks at just sort of the average time of those 58,000 Apple Watch users, of average daily time that they spend in sunlight. And not surprisingly, as we go from winter to spring into summer, you get this rise in outdoor exposure. And surprisingly, the average, even in summer, is still relatively low. It's about 100 minutes. And then it quickly goes down. So we're entering the season of autumn, and where this curve goes down pretty significantly. And you can see over the winter months just how little time people spend outdoors. This is less than 30 minutes on average. One would see that if you tracked back to December, November. So we know that we spend very little time outdoors to begin with. And often when we are outdoors, we are protected to the extent that we don't allow ourselves any meaningful benefit of that sunlight. And Dr. Moore-Eid has I like this. He calls it sunlight obstruction syndrome.
Yeah.
This just general public health challenge of simply not getting enough sunlight at strategic times year round, which is very important. And many health issues. I mean, this reads like a cornucopia of chronic complex diseases, all of which have gone up with tremendous prevalence in the United States and around the world. And again, that brings us to this study in particular, John, and these four trajectories that I had talked about, where some kids just got a lot of light at night, artificial light at night throughout their lives, really through pretty much their entire development, from young children through their late teenage years. You see one cohort actually cutting down, and then you see these other two with more gradual increments. And so it allowed them to sort of quantify by these quartiles what risk was over time. And this is just a snapshot of the data. Those with the highest risk of obesity and metabolic changes were those that started high and continued high. And you see this hazard ratio, almost twice the risk compared to those who showed a decline in their artificial light exposure at night. And you see this for both boys and girls. So the suggestion was that while artificial light and the amounts that we're getting today are not at all healthy and certainly may be disease promoting, it's particularly problematic when you start with high exposures at very, very young ages, whether it be just compact fluorescent lighting or just a lot of time on your smartphones and technology. And this is a book, John, I just wanted to recommend to folks, and I'll come back toward the end of our discussion. This was published last year by Dr. Moore-Eid. It's the most comprehensive overview of this subject that is available, and I think he's one of the most noteworthy light researchers, certainly in the United States. And his advocacy for public health and for getting our regulators to think differently about requirements for lighting, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, John, it has been very inspiring. And he's part of development of some smart lights, if you will, that I'll share with our listeners toward the end of our discussion. So that's just an overview of this study, John, and I think it on some level is not surprising. Again, these aren't cause and effect, but as we've talked many times, we know there are many mechanisms that lack of natural light and excess exposures of non-native light mechanistically are known to completely disrupt circadian biology, and all of that can be in some way traced to obesity, weight-related problems, metabolic problems, depression, anxiety, right? That sunshine obstruction syndrome. And so, yeah, I'll pause there, John, and just kind of get your preliminary thoughts when you looked at this.
Yeah, no, to your point, Mark, I mean, it's affirmation of, previous studies and what, I think what researchers have observed with really the global population now spending too much time in front of artificial light and all of the kind of downstream effects that has is, I think it's pretty well established. This is a great paper given the population size and, to your point, the way that it was carried out over that amount of years is really remarkable. The analogy I like to use with light that I know you agree with, Mark, is that much like we're an overfed yet malnourished population now, it's the same thing with light. So we're like kind of drowning in artificial light, especially at the wrong time of day. And then yet we're also malnourished with respect to real sunlight, full spectrum light. And it's, again, I think it's the exact same situation. So we have all these effects on human physiology from light exposure, like, 10, 11, midnight. I mean, God, most people are on their phones now at around midnight. And, that, as you know, Mark, that initiates a lot of hormonal changes in the body. It can really stop or arrest kind of the hormonal production that you want, the endocrine function. You want to have more human growth hormone, right? You want to have that window of time in complete darkness where your body can really recover, repair. That's true rest, but you don't get that with that kind of light exposure. All of those things are stopped. And then we know that the pancreas, for instance, really is very, very sensitive to this circadian entrainment or deregulation. I think that's really what comes into play here, specifically with this paper, where you see that, these children have such a much higher prevalence of obesity with that nighttime exposure. The pancreas is just going to produce a little more insulin over years and years and years. And then as young adults, a lot of these kids end up with mild to severe insulin resistance. And, that diet aside, to your point, this is an association observation. So while we can't prove cause and effect, obviously there's a mechanism at work with the highest risk group here. And, when you take a look at what the primary driving factor is for obesity and insulin resistance, it's the way the pancreas is kind of deregulated over time. So I think it's we talk about like these kind of core issues for human physiology in the modern world. And I think this is phenomenal, Mark, because it ties so many things together.
And I love that comparison, John, of being overfed and undernourished to the current state of light exposure. This sort of notion of solar nutrition, being nourished
Mm-hmm.
by light, and we often make the comparison of junk light to junk food.
Right.
And it takes so long for what would seem obvious to ultimately hit the radar of the medical community, like, oh, is it junk food is actually bad for you, right? You pick up papers today, and the hot papers are about how processed and ultra processed food isn't good for you. It's like,
I
well,
know.
okay, that's it's good to have that affirmation, to use your word, John. But the amount of time it takes for the clinical community to really begin to pivot and address policy and recommendation around these things is just very, very slow. And we often talk about health from the perspective of evolutionary biologic adaptation. And this is a really good example of how the modern environment has changed much faster
Yeah.
than our innate ability to adapt. And so humans, really up until maybe 3, 4 generations ago, relied on natural light. When they used light, it was candle light, very low magnitude of light, not as disruptive at night, because the quality of dark is just as important as the quality of light. And they just spent more time outdoors, and so a lot of these chronic complex disease epidemics are really emergent 20th century. These are 20th century phenomenon that sadly are continuing to challenge all of us to a greater extent, and so we see the prevalence of all these chronic complex diseases going up, not going down.
Yeah.
And I think light is when one looks at light as information, we often look at the environment, all these environmental inputs as information. Ultimately, I think it can be said that humans are these complex uh, uh, systems, biologic systems that are designed to sense what's going on in the environment. We receive information, all kinds of information,
Yeah.
much of which we're not even aware that we're receiving. We then interpret and respond to that information, and that leads to our thoughts and beliefs and behaviors, which is information that we then fast forward into our environments. And so you see this cycle of feed forward, feedback. And if you're not mindful of the quality of the information that from the feedback that you're getting, then you really find yourself kind of behind the eight ball. And so it really is a fascinating subject, because light, I think, is not recognized as information. It's just it's convenient to make it easier to sort of navigate your environment because you can see better. Who thinks about the fact that all those wavelengths of light from non-visible ultraviolet on the sort of lower uh, end of the light continuum to infrared on the higher end of the light continuum, all those things we know hugely impact human biology. And then all the colors in between. And we probably have only recognized a fraction of the ways in which all those frequencies of light influence our biology. And so that information has fundamentally changed for all of us with each passing generation. And um, who you look at kids today and they're all just connected to devices. I'm often struck, John. I live in this beautiful neighborhood in the Berkshires, and we have a lot of young families, and I hardly ever see kids outside. Uh,
Yeah.
every now and then I'll see a kid on a bike. You'll drive by fields and you might see some kids playing because they're in a league.
Yeah.
Um, but kids generally aren't out playing baseball, unless they're on a team and there's a
Right.
game. It's not something you do if it's not sort of on your calendar, not something already scheduled.
Yeah.
And that I think this is to some extent the elephant in the room from a public health perspective.
Yeah. And what you led in with, Mark, about, this time of year, and then showing us that slide with how much of a drop off there is in time. I mean, it's bad to begin with, even in the summer. I mean, about an hour a day, I think, is what that slide showed, or less. And then it gets down to, yeah, that'd be really helpful. Hey, just take a look at that. That's minutes per day. So around 100 minutes is as good as it gets in June, when it's not dark, northern latitudes, until 8:30, 9 o'clock at night. For, like I said earlier, when I use the analogy that we're malnourished with respect to quality light, you and I have talked about this in the past, Mark. It's like, how many chemical reactions does sunlight exposure on the skin drive? I mean, there's so many that people aren't aware of. One of the biggest misconceptions that I find when talking to people about this is that they think it's all about vitamin D. I mean, taking vitamin D in lieu of inadequate sunlight exposure, in my opinion, it's like taking a multivitamin and not eating any vegetables or not eating anything that is nutrient dense. It's just, I understand the effort to try to kind of cover your bases, so to speak, with a vitamin D supplement, but that's not going to influence sulfation. That's not going to influence your body's ability to generate, heparan sulfate, which is what maintains, kind of more ideal or optimal blood viscosity and hemodynamics. I mean, there's just so many components to what natural light does for us. And our mitochondria, I mean, we won't even have time to get into that today, but how our mitochondria look just like photoblasts. And we know that there's a role for sunlight in terms of maintaining mitochondrial health. So there's all these different layers to it where sunlight is just like for plants. You could really argue that it's as essential for us in so many areas of our health and physiology, but all of that is, it's just not really appreciated as much as the research suggests it should be. And if you start to look at seasonality and chronic disease, and there's a lot of different examples of this. We could look at cancer, we could look at heart disease, but it's really clear that, for instance, in North America, I'll use one example, the months with the absolute, really clear highest incidence of heart disease in the way of a myocardial infarction are December and January. You think about it, that's when, for most of North America, you'll have the least amount of sunlight exposure, right? To the point that you illustrated with that slide. I mean, it all dovetails. And so, what's going on in December and January, people would say, oh, it's the holidays. Well, no, it's a lot of it's time indoors, almost no sunlight exposure. And so a huge area of our physiology gets kind of deregulated, and that really lends itself to more people having heart attacks. And I just think it's, again, we have to get to a place, I think, from a public health perspective here, where light is appreciated more. We help populations understand that they need, there's an essential amount that you need per day. And it's going to be really tough from now until, here in New Hampshire, it's going to be really tough, like from now until probably March. You got to make the most of those days you get. But I think this is where, there's, whether it's, red light, full spectrum light, UVB light, there's ways to live in a northern latitude and still get some of that. And it may not be ideal as full spectrum sunlight, but it's going to be a lot better than not having any of it at all.
That's a really good segue, John, into some relatively easy things that people can do to tweak their environment in an effort to better align time of day, light quality exposure as compared to what their current state may be. And I'm always looking at emerging technology. Some of it is just not rocket science, right? Like certainly being outdoors every day, year round, particularly in the morning hours and late afternoon hours, even for 5 or 10 minutes, is powerful. Even if you're not getting some of those stronger magnitudes of light, ultraviolet light, of course, you're not going to get much of that living in North America for the most part. But just I want to come back to something real quick, John. I had a few other slides that I can share. This, in my view, would be an example of the gold standard, right? This is sunlight. And this would be a snapshot of the color spectral pattern of morning daylight. And again, none of the non-native artificial lighting will give you any ultraviolet exposure. And for those that are worried about ultraviolet light and its connection to cancer, yeah, I mean, nobody would question that relationship. But low doses, low exposures of ultraviolet light can allow one to realize the optimal effect of that frequency of light, and at the same time mitigate longer exposures that might put them at increased risk for skin cancer if they have a family history, or maybe they're just very fair skinned. But you see this very broad and pretty much even distribution across the color spectrum into the red and infrared range, also a non-visible frequency. And, as some of our listeners might know, that most of the light that hits the surface of this planet is in the infrared range, about 40% of it. So that's a really important frequency of light. No non-native lighting, artificial lighting, with a few more recent exceptions that I'll share, have any infrared light in them. And so one of the problems is that the regulations that require companies to produce light that provides a certain brightness, which is this L is lumens, a measure of brightness per watt of energy used in an effort to conserve energy. The mandate was any light bulb you produce now has to have a minimum of 40 lumens per watt of electricity used. And the best frequencies to do that are the blue and some of this green. So most of the artificial lights on the market today, in an effort to meet these regulatory standards, have a lot of blue light, some green light, and leave everything else out, because with just these LED frequency ranges, they can produce plenty of lumens, brightness, and use much less electricity. The problem there is that blue light, while it's great during the day, after sunset, this is the light that ordinarily turns on our circadian clock. So when we look at that Chinese study, John, and look at the amount of artificial light that people are exposed to at night, much of that is coming in the form of these blue frequencies. And that is sending the exact opposite information to the brain that our bodies have evolved to be in relationship with. And that's where you start to get disruption of circadian rhythms, and all that comes with that disruption that we've talked about. You also eliminate frequencies of light with these more energy efficient alternatives that, as you alluded to, John, and we just don't have much time to talk about this. You get into the red, infrared, these are critical for energy production, mitochondrial health. And I think we would agree, John, that mitochondrial disruption is probably a driver of most chronic complex diseases, and may be particularly important in those systems that are very high energy, like the brain. So degenerative neurologic diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, probably one could add autism and other manifestations of disrupted brain function, are very dependent on these frequencies of light, which have been all but eliminated in the non-native artificial light industry innovation and development. They check all the boxes for efficiency, but they are really poor for human health. And a couple of companies, and I have no vested interest in these companies. I use their products. I've researched them, and I really believe in the integrity of the data and science that supports what they are doing. This is a company soul shine. And I love this. It sort of relates to your analogy of sunlight as nutrition, John. They have full spectrum light, ideally for the morning. If somebody, I recommend most people living, in North America
Yeah.
have full spectrum morning light. And so when you look at the specs, it's over 10,000 lumens. So it's what you want in morning exposure. It's brighter light. It it really pretty much mimics all of these wavelengths of light. There's mild UV, low levels, but it also has infrared light. Many of the light boxes out there just have bright light, mostly blue, green, and the brightness is important for seasonal shifts and reinforcing that circadian clock, but it will tend to omit many of these other frequencies. So the Soul Ray folks have come up with options that provide not only the brightness, but you're getting the infrared and the full spectrum of visible light, which is really desirable. Another emerging company, and I give these companies credit because they are really butting up against the regulatory environment, um, uh, understanding the health implication. And so this is a company called Sora, and they have one of the first to market zero blue uh, light bulbs. These are ideal to put in a room that you're spending more time in at night, a family room, a bedroom. And again, you're getting all the other frequencies, but they're just eliminating that narrow band of blue light for nighttime exposure. And then the last, and I got some of these now that I'm um, kind of experimenting with, if you will, John. These are the first to market programmable circadian
Wow.
compatible
Hmm.
lights. And
Amazing.
This is OIO, a company that Dr. Martin Eade is part of. Um, I've spoken with some of their science folks, and they are really bringing to market what I think is one of the true innovations that will be available to anyone. And so what these lights do, and again, they look like um, LED lights. They look
Yeah.
like the old incandescent lights. You can program from your phone based on the where you live, the latitude that
Hmm.
you're at, and which times of day you wish uh, the light to shift. These lights are programmable, and during the day you can set it so that you're getting this beautiful full spectrum or blue light. Um, During the overnight hours, and you can just control this from your phone. The light will shift to totally eliminating this blue band, which has been the most important wavelength for mitigating disruption of circadian rhythm. And again, they even give you a little handheld prism. You can hold it up to the light and see these differences in frequencies. So this is IOI. They're a new company. And again, I have no financial um, ties to any of these companies. I just really believe in the technology. And so I do my checklist, John, for this time of year is some full spectrum lighting in the morning uh, for 20 minutes minimum. Uh, I then will have either a warm LED or one of these newer technology lights in rooms that I'm spending more time at night in. After sunset, when it's dark, I want to try to manage the blue light exposure that I'm getting. These are really nice ways to do that. I will, wear blue glasses. If I'm in an environment where I don't have as much influence over the lighting, you go into a a big box retailer at 8 p.m. and you're baked under those fluorescent lights, you're going to buy something that you definitely don't need. And so there are strategic times where I will wear these. And so, these are all, and then just getting more time outside, as we talk about, John. I think these are they're so simple that it's hard for people to appreciate how powerful they can be. But this is uh, definitely an opportunity.
It's awesome stuff, Mark. I think those light bulbs that's revolutionary. We try to use incandescents wherever we can, but those are tough to find nowadays.
Yeah, they went off the market in
Yeah.
like 2019 when the EPA, they changed. You had to meet this 40 lumen per watt standard, and
Right.
every incandescent bulb immediately no longer met those. So unless you hoarded them, as I did and others have, they're hard to find now. But that was one of the original great light sources.
Yeah.
What I love about some of these newer lights is that they are more energy efficient, and they do, particularly some of the daytime lights, full spectrum lights, also include infrared. So that's a nice plus. And so the technology really is evolving in a really positive way. I think people just need to be more aware of how important
Yeah.
all of this is.
Right. It's great stuff, Mark.
So, John, always a pleasure connecting, and all of this will end up on our website, thehealthedgepodcast.com. We haven't had a chance to do as many recordings. Life has been very rich and complicated, and we'll come back when the spirit moves us. But we appreciate that people still listen in and share with their friends. And news to use is what we love to share, and it's a joy as always, John.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Mark.
You bet.